Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Slightly Scientific Podcast, the monthly podcast hosted by three teenagers that make sure you always get your dose of scientific knowledge. Sitting next to me virtually, as always, is Finley, and we hope you enjoy. Today, we are going to be interviewing Amina Memon.
Amina Memon has a PhD in psychology with more than 30 years of experience and is an expert witness in civil and criminal cases.
Before we do that, we need to announce the fact of the month. Finley, over to you.
Cotton candy was invented by a dentist.
That's a brilliant fact, Finley. What? Why is cotton... Okay, does it give you an explanation to why cotton candy was invented by a dentist?
Probably wanted more sales. No, I don't know.
Do you think he made it healthy cotton candy? You know how some people, they like to turn foods into healthy foods? Maybe he invented a healthy cotton candy, and then all of a sudden people thought, wait, we can make it really unhealthy.
I don't know, wait. Why would it... Okay.
Now, if you'd like your scientific fact featured on next month's podcast, make sure to tweet us at @theslightly_sci. Now, on to the interview.
Why did you decide to study psychology?
Well, I actually fell into it because I was doing chemistry, biology and physics at an all-girls school, and the chemistry teaching just wasn't any good. So they sent me to a boys' school to do chemistry, and I just didn't like it, the atmosphere there at all. And I needed a third A-level, and A-level psychology had just been introduced that year as a new subject. And the local further education college was advertising for students. And I'd always been interested in the brain and behaviour because growing up, sadly, my brother had some mental health issues. And so I knew that was something to do with his behaviour was something. At the time, I didn't understand if it was chemical or if it was environmental, but that kind of got me interested in human behaviour. And then when I saw this course being advertised, I thought, oh, I'll give it a go. And I went along for a kind of an interview with the teacher, and I really liked the teacher. And I thought, right, I'm going to do this. So, yeah, if I'd stuck with chemistry, I probably would never have done psychology. So,
do you think it would, psychology was more fun than chemistry? Are you really
happy? Definitely, yeah. I mean, as soon as I started doing it as an A-level subject, I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And obviously I ended up doing a degree in it. So I thought, oh no, this is what I felt this was something that where my passion lay. And I liked it more than, because I loved biology at school, but psychology just took over, and I was fascinated and I wanted to know more. So I thought, right, this is for me, this is my subject. Yeah.
What do you, so when you go to study psychology at a university and when you go to do a PhD, what exactly do you learn? Because I've only read books about psychology, and they obviously don't go into much detail. So what exactly is because in biology, you can learn all sorts of things like the immune system and everything. What are the different branches you can take with psychology?
Yeah, so it's the scientific study of behavior and the mind, and everything that influences the way we behave and feel and think and act. So it's everything to do with what we're trying to do as scientists, and it's considered to be a science in the same way biology and physics and other sciences are. And what we're trying to do is predict human behaviour. So we start off with topics like developmental psychology, how the brain develops over time. So there'll be how we learn language, how we interact with our social world, how we recognise faces developmentally, how we mature and how our behaviour changes across the lifespan, from infanthood right through to older aging process, and how that affects the brain and behaviour. We look at social psychology, which has to do with how we interact with the world around us. So it looks at behaviour in groups, behaviour in different societies, how we behave as individuals and in a group, and how social pressures may lead us to follow a leader, may lead us to follow our gang, to support our football club, and how that might shape the way we behave, and also crowd behaviour, basically the individual in their social environment. We look at brain physiology. So we have a big field, which is neuroscience, which looks at how the brain develops and the different regions of the brain that are responsible for different kinds of behavior, and how to map that behavior to better understand also not just the normal brain, but what happens when there's damage to certain areas of the brain, and where different tasks are performed in the brain, like hearing, remembering, seeing, how we interact, again, how we interact with the world and how we can measure that in terms of our brain output. And so we do that using technology like MRI scanners that you've probably seen. So we have social developmental, we have personality theory, which looks at how our personality develops across the lifespan and the major aspects of our personality. We have abnormal psychology, which looks at what goes wrong, what can go wrong with our mental health, and what sorts of behaviors may result and what the causes of them are. We look at criminal and forensic psychology, which is more my area, which looks at everything from why offences occur, what types of offenders commit what types of crime, how you can investigate and prevent crime, how you can achieve justice, and how someone might behave in the courtroom, how they may behave in an interview, how a suspect's behavior might be sort of manipulated during an interview. We also look at juries and how juries behave, and there's an overlap there with social psychology. So yeah, language, there's a whole topic, it's a whole area of psychology. So many different areas. I mean, easily enough to do 3 years of study at university.
Wow, yeah. That's a lot of stuff. And did you study all of what you just said, or just maybe the forensics part?
Every degree has to be accredited by the British Psychological Society. So all the university courses have to have the same syllabus, just like you have for GCSE and A-level. You know, you have an external body. Our external body is the British Psychological Society, and they really police our degrees to make sure we cover all the core areas, because when you graduate, you're a graduate and you can be a graduate member of the British Psychological Society. So it's assumed that you've gone to a university where you've achieved the standard that's expected and that you've covered all the core areas. I should say that in addition to all the different subject areas, a core part is learning how to conduct research and design studies, and also analyze the data from those studies using statistics. So research methods and design is a core subject that we cover throughout the 3 years, so that we also develop people into independent researchers by the end of the 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what really makes it a science.
So it's really like, just like any science, you're analyzing and you're using statistics to come to like a conclusion.
Yeah, we're analysing behaviour. We have hypotheses, and we test hypotheses, and they're either supported or refuted. And we also replicate our studies, which is really important. So somebody might do a study in one lab, but it's considered to be very important that somebody else can independently create the same findings in another lab.
Yeah.
And obviously that's really important right now with COVID, because as these vaccines are being developed and rolled out, and lots of different university labs are doing studies using slightly different vaccines, but essentially they ought to be achieving very similar results. And ideally, you'd want different labs to be testing those studies, because sometimes scientists can be a bit biased in that they really want their hypothesis to be supported, and they only see what they want to see, and they might miss something small, a small side effect possibly that they've overlooked because they're so enthusiastic about. So you have to, it's really important. We also have to be subject to something called peer review, which means every time we finish a piece of research and we write it up, it has to go, if we send it to a journal to publish it, it has to be independently reviewed by 2 or 3 scientists in the field, who often they don't know who we are, so that it doesn't influence them. Say we're already famous and we're, you know, presenting a study, they can't be biased by that. So they have to independently review our work, and often they're very critical, and you have to there's quite a big chance that your paper is going to be rejected. And if it is accepted, you have to often make a lot of modifications. So the standards are very high to get published, but that publication is a measure of what an independent expert thinks, or 2 or 3 experts think about your research. So that's kind of what makes psychology a science as well, because I would say it's even harder to get published in psychology than it is in some of the sciences, because the peer reviewers set a very high bar.
Yeah.
So we have to achieve a very high standard, especially to get into the best journals.
Yeah.
I see.
What cases, if any, have been refuted, no matter how much you try?
So one of my, I was really lucky, because when I did my PhD, which, you know, so you do your degree, which takes 3 years, and I went straight on to do my doctoral study. And my very first doctoral study was just a literature review. So I was looking at, I was studying face recognition, and I was looking at what factors affect how well we can recognize a stranger's face that we've seen earlier. This is linked to my interest in eyewitness memory. And my first study worked out really well. My hypotheses were supported. But my second study that I submitted for publication wasn't accepted, because I can't even remember now, because it was so long ago. But I have, over the years, have had papers that haven't been accepted. And often because the kind of studies I do, because I'm looking at real world issues, it's really hard to control for everything. So I did a study on interviewing, where I had different interviewers using my technique, and there was differences in how effective those interviewers were. And it wasn't because of the technique, but I think it had to do with the personality of those interviewers. And so there you couldn't conclude that one technique was superior over another because of the technique. It might have been that one interviewer was just better at establishing a relationship with the person they were interviewing due to their personality. And so when you've got like noisy, what's called noisy data like that, you might get, your research might get rejected. I ended up publishing that research eventually. I had to make quite a few changes, but it's a bit of a game sometimes. It feels like you're really struggling to get into those top journals. But it's really good to get criticism on your research as well, because it's like free, you know, you're getting people to comment for free, because we don't get paid for reviewing articles, other people's research. We do it as part of our everyday job as scientists. So, but you learn a lot from the criticisms that other people give you of your work. So I think that's a really good thing, because that's how we make progress in science, by having our hypotheses refuted and someone else coming up with an alternative theory that's more plausible and more likely to be supported by research. So that's how we make progress, really.
I was going to ask, so if you like are doing, if you're testing a physics hypothesis, obviously it's probably easier to control all the independent variables. But in psychology, how do you do that? You must have like tons of independent variables, from like personality to.
Yeah, it can be quite hard. So we're expected to have, so the way you do your research is you decide you're going to focus on 1 or 2 independent variables in a simple study. So and so one of my students at the moment, my 3rd year students, are doing a project where they're looking at how someone presents themselves when they're talking about a distressing event. So say, and in this case, there's somebody who is describing their dog having died. And what they're interested in is how, when someone presents themselves in a very obviously emotional manner following a distressing event, are they more likely to be believed to be telling the truth than when they're talking about something terrible, but they're not showing any emotion? So how does emotion, the sort of seeing someone be emotional, affect whether you believe them or not, when they're giving an account of something that's happened to them? So they basically have the same person and they recorded him talking about his dog having died. And in one condition, he either just had a numb bland expression when he was describing it. And then the second one, he looked visibly upset. His voice was shaky. He was describing how his dog had died. And ideally, it's just one person. You know, it might be something about his face. It might be because he's a male. It could be anything. But we just decided to hold it constant. So we only had one person, one scenario. You know, some people might think that's not really a very distressing event, having your dog die. We did ask people if they've got a pet or not, because we thought that might affect the results. We did do a pilot study where we showed him and another actor. We had two actors. The other actor was talking about doing badly in his exams, and he wasn't as believable. So we ended up using this one actor. So the way you do, in answer to your question, what you do is you just try and keep it really simple and focus on one variable at a time. So we really focused on just him, his facial expressions, either displaying emotion or not. That's all we did. And we didn't like look at who he was, how old he was, or any of those, or what his personality was, or even his accent. No, so many other factors that could maybe influence whether, you know, someone's believed. And sometimes it's just something simple, like whether you like the person or not, that might impact whether you believe them. So yeah, the way we control those variables is to really like isolate what we're studying. In this case, the emotion expressed when somebody's talking about a distressing event, and just holding everything else constant as much as possible, you know. But that's not to say people aren't going to be influenced by other factors. Yeah.
And so you did your PhD on like forensic and in investigations. So what cognitive techniques do you use in these investigations to
So I don't know if you've ever seen Crime Watch. And in Crime Watch, one of the things they do is they do crime scene reconstruction. And so what that does is it takes the person back to the context, the scene. Almost, it doesn't, you don't take them back to the scene of the crime, but you get them to mentally take themselves back to that day to try and trigger their memory. And a lot of the techniques that I work with are based on triggering people's memories. So the idea is that we store a lot more information than we can actually access. And I always say, think of our memories stored behind a locked door. And in order to get into that door, you need to know, you need to have a key. And in order to have a key that fits, you need to know the shape of the lock. And this is a basic principle of memory that shows if you can take someone back to the environment where they learned the materials, whether it's a list of words, whether it's a scene that they witnessed, where they now have to see if they can recognize that person. What you do is you get them to mentally take themselves back to that scene. And when we witness things, if we're in a particular environment, we are not just seeing what's going on around them. That whole environment is made up of different things. It's made up of sounds, what we hear. It's made up of obviously what we see. It might be made up of smells. It may be made up of our feelings. If it's, you know, if we're at a football stadium and our team's playing, there might be a lot of emotions associated with that. There might be also lots of distracting thoughts going through our head. So what we do is with our technique, which is called the cognitive interview, we take people back, we help people go back to that original scene where they first encountered, say, often our case, the criminal or the suspect. They're now a witness. So we get them, first of all, we make them very relaxed, and we make them feel very comfortable about talking about what they've seen. And because often when you interview someone, they just expect the interviewer to do all the talking. And so we sort of try and reduce that barrier, and we try and bring them down to our level and get them really comfortable and relaxed, hearing the sound of their own voice. And then we help them go back to the scene of the whatever we're testing their memory for. If it is for something that happened at this football match, we get them to take themselves back there. And it might mean like right up to that morning when they woke up, when they were getting ready to go to the event. And we get them to sort of mentally arrive back at that scene and then describe what they can see by actually really mentally imagining almost like that they're there. And then we use a simple instruction, which is just to get people to report every single thing that they can remember, to report in detail. And then sometimes they also report from different perspectives. So they might, if they're with someone else, they might report, something from the perspective of the person they were with. But you have to be very careful with some of these techniques, because obviously we don't want people to guess. So we say to them at the beginning, we don't want you to guess or make anything up. If you really don't know, say you don't know. So it's a whole package of techniques, but mostly what they do is they jog people's memory, and they're based on understanding kind of what this lock is like, and having this analogy that our techniques are like the key, and the key is based on how our memories are organized. And so what those techniques do is you find you can get people to remember a lot more detail, and generally what they remember is quite accurate. So that's really good, because when there's an investigation, the police actually want to have as much information as possible, because they need as many leads as possible. So, and sometimes there's only like 1 or 2 witnesses and there's no other evidence. So the eyewitness, as they're called, can be really crucial. So it's really important to know how to question them.
Yeah. Why does the brain lock away the memories?
Yeah, so the brain locking away the memories is a little bit of a misnomer, because sometimes our memories can be inaccessible for a very long time because we haven't rehearsed them, or because they're upsetting. And so we may not have thought about things that happened. So we may not remember we may not be able to describe in great detail our first day at school, when we first started school, or nursery, if it was that. But, if we were to begin talking about it, and, getting you to think about, where you were living at the time, sort of if there was anything else significant in your life, we know that we could probably get you to say a little bit about your first day at school. And if you were to even take you back there, just the smells and the sounds might give you even more details. But one of the things we've got to really be careful of is, just because you haven't been asked to describe your school for many years now, so like 10, 11 years, doesn't mean the memories, just because they're locked away, that they're going to be securely stored, untainted. Because locking away doesn't mean that memory is actually exactly the same as it was when it was locked, if you know what I mean. So we have to be very careful that we don't think just because it's locked away, it's in its pure form. Just like, if you were to, I'm trying to think of an analogy, but that memory is gonna be faded. It will fade over time. So you can't recreate everything. Obviously, photographs might help you check, those details, and obviously we rely on those sorts of things. But for crimes, often we don't have photographs. We might have CCTV evidence, but even that can be really tricky. Even if we've caught someone on camera, when it comes to matching their face to the person who's the suspect, that can also be very, very difficult. So sometimes we just have to be careful with that locked away analogy.
Yeah, that's crazy, the fact that I can't remember something right now, but if my brain's stimulated with some sort of scent or something, if I see something that's related to the memory, it can be try and get it back. That's really
it's a very, very powerful smell, and emotions as well are very, very powerful ways of remembering. So it's we remember. There was there's a study that the students that do A levels always study in memory, which is a really cool study done by a psychologist called Alan Baddeley. And in that study, what they did is they got to demonstrate this principle of, we call it context reinstatement. They got divers to learn word lists. I don't know if you've heard of this study. They learned the word lists on land and underwater. So on land, they learned them on the beach, and then they got them to, they also got them to learn other word lists underwater. And they found that people were more likely to remember the word, they remembered more words when they were tested underwater, when they learned the word list underwater, and they remembered more words when they were tested on the beach if they'd learned the list on the beach. So these divers did best when they were tested in their environment where they learned the lists, whether that was on land or underwater, which is a really cool study.
That's really cool. So if I'm about to take an exam, should I go to the exam hall and like learn it all there?
Yeah, you could, yeah. And I'm wondering how our students are going to do this year, because all my students are going to do 24-hour exams at home this year because of COVID.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They're not going to be on campus doing their exams. And I think there's a real opportunity for them, because they'll presumably be sitting in the same room, on the same desk where they had me lecture, because I'm lecturing from this room as well, and they're receiving that information on their desk or wherever else they are, because the students don't put their cameras on, so I don't know where they are, but I'm assuming they're in the same room that they're studying in. So that will be interesting. I think, yeah, it's not an experiment, because everybody's going to be doing their exams at home. So ideally we'd have half of them go onto campus and do their exams in the exam hall, but somehow I don't think anyone's going to volunteer to do that.
No, I wouldn't.
No. So I think there is something to be said, especially when it comes to exams as well. There's so many factors that the exam stress can be much more debilitating in an unfamiliar environment. So yeah, I mean, ideally, familiar environment. Yeah, that, or use some kind of relaxation technique when doing your exams. Yeah.
These techniques you're talking about before, do they work on everyone, and can they be used in everyday life?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so a lot of psychology experiments, and when these cognitive techniques were first developed, a lot of the studies were done with college students. In America, they referred to university students as college students. And so the interviewers who were doing the interviews were college students, and the students were college students. And generally, this is a younger age group, 18 to 24-ish, and, not really representative of the population of witnesses. So one of the contributions that I've made is I always made sure that I did my studies, I replicated them with children. So I went and did studies in schools where I interviewed children about events. We created all sorts of events like eye tests where the children had to describe the person that did their eye test, a magic show. I also did work I recruited older adults from walking groups, and I did stuff with 60 to 80-year-olds outside of the college population. But again, the population I tended to get was still more individuals from privileged backgrounds. Like for the walking groups, they were sort of mostly middle-class, older adults who were quite healthy and well. We did recruit a few people from nursing homes, but obviously we had to be very careful with that group. And the children that we recruited for our studies were still, they were from a mixture of schools, but they were quite competent generally. And so I was really lucky to form a collaboration with a researcher in Brazil, and was fortunate enough to go over there, and we did a study using all the cleaning staff at the university in Brazil where we worked, and they came from a very different social class background, to see if we set up an event and showed them it was a crime on video, whether they could use the techniques. And we were really pleased to find that the techniques benefited their memory as well. So that's a really good question. It was really important that our techniques generalized to representative sectors of the population. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to necessarily apply them.
Yeah. What does it mean to have an LLM in human rights?
Oh yeah, that's so it's a master's. It's a special master's, and it doesn't actually qualify me to practice law. It's usually a specialism. It's considered to be a specialism. And in this case, I was interested in international human rights. I didn't know very much about human rights, but I felt at the time I did the master's, I was thinking maybe career change. And I wanted to see if I was to move out of psychology and work in a related field. And I was very interested in justice, criminal justice, whether human rights might help me in some way. But it was also an opportunity to study another subject as an adult, which I never had. So, and in the end, I didn't do anything with that human rights master's. Yeah, but I have it. So, yeah.
What is your most interesting case, or just one of your most interesting cases?
So I've had the opportunity to testify in criminal and civil cases as an expert on memory and child memory, and sometimes on historic abuse, which is a case where an adult is remembering something that happened to them a long time ago when they were a child. And I've had, the hardest thing is that often I get presented with evidence in the form of a statement that a witness has made when they've been interviewed. What they've said has happened to them, and the expectation is that I might be able to tell whether the person is lying or telling the truth. But often you can't tell. It's very, very hard to tell. All I can do is comment on the quality of the interview. And I have had cases where sometimes the victims have been very young children, sort of as young as 2 or 3 years old, who've been victims of child abuse. And I guess the most memorable case was where one of the victims had the same name as me. So that felt quite emotional. And I was very pleased that when I went into court to talk about that case, she was only 2 or 3, I can't remember exactly, very young. And it had taken four months for that case to get to trial, which is a long time in the life of I think she was 3 by the time it got to court. So you're looking at a potential child victim, and it has taken like several months for that case to come to trial. Now the child is older, the child, is still very young, doesn't remember very much about what happened to her. Potentially her mum was in a wheelchair, her mum was also a victim. Somebody in the place where her mum worked had potentially abused this little girl. And the best outcome in that case was, I couldn't tell whether she was, when she was interviewed, exactly whether she had been a victim or not. But the great thing there was the judge said, when he heard my evidence, he said, I've really learned something today. I've learned that in these cases, we need to move very, very quickly. We can't have such a young victim of abuse and then have several months pass by before this case is heard and the evidence is looked at, because now so much time has passed. And also that person is still at large. If they are indeed an abuser, there's justice hasn't been served. And that judge said that they were going to make sure that they would listen to sort of what I said about, the problems of memory in a young child, and make sure that that was communicated. And they were going to do something about the fact that, in these cases, often there's a very long delay. And later on, I heard that indeed, I don't know what happened to the little girl, but I did hear that the same person who was accused of another crime and was eventually convicted. So that was kind of good that justice was served. I don't know what happened in the case of the little girl, and I didn't inquire because I'm not supposed to make a personal judgment or form any personal connection. So I never follow up my cases. And I always give both sides, I'm always very objective in the evidence I get. But I hope that when I'm doing things, I'm making the right decisions. And sometimes it's really hard, because sometimes you look at an interview and you think that's a really poor interview, and I can't tell by looking at this interview if the person's describing something that really happened to them or not. And that you just don't know, and you're hoping that the outcome is going to be the correct one, but we don't always know what happens. We don't always know if we've made the right judgment.
Wow, that must be quite the pressure on you to try and figure out.
Yeah, and sometimes we get so I think in that case, or another similar case, what I did is, and when I was leaving the courtroom, the police officer who had interviewed the child followed me out of the courtroom and tapped me on the shoulder and said, you had, criticized my interviewing. And I said, yes, because I noticed you haven't undergone the training. And that was a really nice conversation, because he said, yeah, I hadn't really, I'd like to know more about the training and how I can get the training. And so we were able to have a conversation, but, that was a good feeling as well, because I felt I could have a conversation about that training. And yeah, I mean, those situations are good, because you feel, but normally you just leave and you don't see the other witnesses and you don't see the people whose cases you've commented on. So it's quite good if you feel you can make a difference in some way without being judgmental, because we, like I say, we have to be really objective in the courtroom.
What kind of person makes a good psychologist, in your own words?
I think somebody who's appropriately trained and who's really committed to their job. The British Psychological Society expects us to conform to very high ethical standards. So we have to be, obviously we have to have integrity. We have to, when working with, people as a clinical psychologist, we have to observe the guidance in having what kind of relationship we have with our patients. We have to follow a code of ethics when we do our research. And I think you have to be committed to your discipline and follow, ethical, appropriate practice and procedures. In science, it's very important to be objective. And also acknowledge your weaknesses and limitations and not go beyond the knowledge that you have.
Thank you so much. I think we've just run out. We're running out of time now.
I know. I can see that.
Yeah. I was looking at it okay. But this has been amazing to be able to talk to you about this. It's really interesting to see somebody's views who's actually done this and has got a PhD in psychology and has been through all of this. I'm trying to.
Really fascinating.
It is.
So thank you to Amina Memon, and thank you guys for listening. And my favourite part was the part where we learned that you're more likely to remember things the place where you learned them. For example, scuba divers who were taught things on a beach were more likely to remember things on a beach, and scuba divers who were taught things underwater were more likely to remember things underwater.
Yeah, I found that really interesting. My favourite part was when she said how some of our memories are actually we can't access them, but when you really think about the sense and you think about all these different things and familiar places, you can actually start to remember things that you didn't even think you could remember. I think that's amazing.
So anyway, we will be back next month with another podcast. Stay tuned.